Good afternoon on today's Angry Alien Bulletin. Astronomers have discovered no less than 9 objects in Earth orbit that do not correspond to any known natural astronomical phenomena. They instead closely resemble artificial objects, but they absolutely cannot be satellites because these objects appeared in our skies before satellites even existed. All of this and more coming at you on the Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to the Angry Astronaut. I apologize ahead of time for any faults that may occur with my voice and my dialogue. I apologize. Still fighting my way through this flu, definitely on the mend, but nevertheless still having some issues speaking, amongst other things, which is, of course, a pretty big blow to a YouTuber, but nevertheless, I want to make sure that I continue getting you all of this information, especially this particular story, because it's something that I've really wanted to share with you guys for some time, and there's just been one spaceflight crisis after another, as many of you probably know, that has been rearing their ugly heads in the news, and so that all needed to be covered. But as far as this discovery is concerned, well, it's mind-blowing in the extreme. One of the biggest problems, as I have stated before, with the study of UFOs and the whole idea that they might be extraterrestrial craft of some kind is there's no corroborating evidence in the astronomical record. That is to say, we have detected some astronomical phenomena that may be alien technosignatures of some kind. However, these are phenomena that exist in faraway star systems, not something that exists in our own solar system. One of the few examples of something that has appeared in the solar system that might have been alien technology is, of course, Oumuamua. And this may be the only real glaring example, at least in recent history, of an astronomical phenomena that appears to be alien technology and could theoretically be associated with some of the craft that we've been seeing lately. That is to say, spherical UFOs approximately 1 to 2 meters in diameter, because at the same time that Oumuamua was making its way through the solar system, a small spherical object pierced our atmosphere from an interstellar destination and splashed down off the coast of Portugal. Not the object that hit off the coast of New Guinea, but another one 3 years later off the coast of Portugal. By the way, Dr. Avi Loeb is interested in investigating that particular crash site. But other than that, we don't have a whole lot of astronomical data to back up the idea that whatever we are seeing in our skies might have an extraterrestrial origin. Or do we? Well, for those of you who have been watching my channel, you might remember another episode that I released where I talked about a phenomena that took place back in 1952. Something very unusual had appeared in our skies, and by in our skies, I'm talking somewhere out in space, and at most about a light year away, and more probably a lot closer to our planet, 3 strange points of light that shouldn't have been there and were gone after about 45 minutes or so, not corresponding to any sort of astronomical phenomena that we have any familiarity with. Instead, this bore a greater resemblance to an artificial object in space. Problem was, 1952, we had launched precisely nothing into space at that time. And what I'm talking about here is a team of astronomers who have been investigating a collection of photographic plates from the Mount Palomar Observatory from the 1950s. Originally, the intention was simply to observe a very comprehensive collection of photographs of the night sky that were taken at that time period by some of the best optical instruments on the planet in those days, when they wouldn't be interfered with by human satellites. We'd have an opportunity to study all kinds of astronomical phenomena without having to worry about those pesky satellites. But then some very unusual things began to appear, and not just this one incident in 1952. A couple of years prior to that, 9 different objects appeared suddenly in these photographic plates, objects that shouldn't have been there, objects that bear no resemblance whatsoever to known astronomical phenomena, but instead appear to be artificial objects that shouldn't have been there either. Now, it may surprise you to discover that none of the astronomers involved in this study were Dr. Avi Loeb or anybody associated with Dr. Avi Loeb. Instead, it was a team led by Dr. Beatriz Villarroel from the Royal Institute of Technology at Stockholm University. Now, the particular study that I'm going to be quoting extensively from is called A Glint in the Eye, Photographic Plate Archive Searches for Non-Terrestrial Artifacts. And I'll tell you, there's some amazing things that this team has uncovered over the last several years that they've been examining these plates. And once again, it is very difficult to dismiss their discoveries as some sort of asteroid, some sort of astronomical event, because none of these things would correspond to what they've observed. Astronomical events like supernovas or stellar flares do not disappear in a mere 45 minutes or an hour, which is what was observed in these particular photographic plates, and a passing asteroid should have left some sort of streak on a time exposure plate, not remaining stationary with the rest of the stars unless it was in geosynchronous orbit. And if an asteroid were in geosynchronous orbit, it too would not have disappeared so quickly. And yet, there are 9 different objects, or transients as they are called, that were found in these plates that correspond to something being in orbit that appeared very artificial and not natural at all. Now, they could have fallen into 2 different categories according to the study. An active type of NTA, as they call it, or non-terrestrial artifact, and a passive NTA. What's the difference? Well, an active NTA is an active probe, spacecraft, something that is in geosynchronous orbit for a brief period of time and then departs. A passive NTA is a piece of space debris that happened to end up in orbit for a while and were visible at least part of the time because they were metallic and highly reflective, and the sunlight revealed their presence in some of the plates, but not necessarily in all of them because they were rotating. The authors discovered 9 simultaneous transients visible in a 10 by 10 arc-minute size image of the sky exposed in 1950. The objects were not visible half an hour earlier or 6 days later. Follow-up observations with a 10.4 meter Gran Telescopio Canarias telescope, that is to say, a large modern telescope designed to find these objects if they happen to be stars that were flaring at that particular moment, as unlikely a coincidence as that might have been, could not link any counterparts to the original transient objects. Based on the timescales and the density of events, the authors ruled out all known astrophysical phenomena such as optical afterglows from gamma ray bursts, microlensing events, asteroids, meteors, variable or flaring stars, pretty much any astronomical phenomena. Problems with the telescope or other instruments associated with these observations were either excluded or deemed highly improbable by the researchers because they're pretty familiar with what those sorts of errors look like, and these were not them. So that being the case, they must have been objects located inside the solar system given their synchronous behavior. It's premature to claim, of course, that simultaneous transients represent alien artifacts of some kind, even if they were observed years before Sputnik was launched. It could, for example, have been contamination or emulsion defects on the plates themselves, which could only be discerned under a microscope, but up to this point, the researchers have found no evidence whatsoever to suggest that those things have happened either. Instead, we have to assume that whatever these objects were, they were hover briefly in our solar system in the field of view of this telescope in 1950, and then they simply vanished. And as we know from the previous video where we examined another incident that took place in 1952, these incidents are sometimes closely related to UFO events that take place here on Earth. As all of us also know, 1950 was a very active year for UFOs in the United States and elsewhere. Now, it's also interesting to note that 6 of these 9 transients are linear in nature. That is to say, they appear multiple times along the same line. Now, what that could suggest is something rotating, something highly reflective, rotating and being detected several times in the time exposure photograph, as opposed to something that is uniformly reflective, which would have appeared as a streak on the photographic plate instead. And this corresponds to satellites that are not uniformly reflective, but are instead fast transient glints caused by the reflection of the sun. When the reflective surface of the satellite coincides perfectly with position of the observer and the sun, a short but powerful glint can be observed. Despite the fast movement of the satellites, the very brief reflective alignment means that the resulting short duration glint looks very much like a star, or an afterglow from a gamma ray burst, or a fast radio burst. Indeed, searches for astrophysical transients show that most of the transients we detect in the automated surveys are just solar reflections from artificial objects in geosynchronous orbit, which is one of the reasons why this survey was conducted in the first place, because this should be devoid of any artificial flares. And yet, there they are, the particularly bright and fast glint that we would expect to find with a flat, mirror-like artificial structure on a satellite or space debris, not from an asteroid which has neither the shape nor the necessary reflectivity to create these strong sub-second glints that were observed in these photographic plates. Now, there's one other very spooky observation that we need to keep in mind when it comes to these particular discoveries. If these sorts of objects existed in orbit in 1950, when there were no other artificial objects to detect, might some of them still be there now? Because after all, there's a large percentage of the current population of orbiting objects that we've detected recently that don't correspond to any satellite or any launch that we can point to. Now, that of course doesn't mean that everything we can't identify in orbit right now has an alien origin. It just might be a fragment of some sort of destroyed satellite or some sort of leftover booster, that sort of thing that we've just lost track of over the years. But that doesn't mean that all of it corresponds to human-made debris. There could be a large number of alien artifacts just hanging around in orbit right now that we see on a regular basis and simply dismiss because it looks like the sort of artificial detritus that we leave in orbit. But it might not be, given the fact that we have found things in orbit now that were definitely there and definitely looked artificial back before we were putting artificial things in orbit. So what does that mean? Does it mean that UFOs, that evidence of alien civilizations, may have been hanging around in orbit right in front of our noses and we just haven't recognized it yet? Well, very soon, a number of companies are going to begin a cleanup operation in low Earth orbit. It's not going to go quickly, and there isn't a hell of a lot of money being invested in it, but how ironic it would be if one of these cleanup operations were to stumble across something that we've been looking so hard for over all these years, hanging around in plain sight. I'd like to thank Christopher Marshall, our latest Patreon supporter who came in at the end of February. Thank you very much for supporting this channel. If you'd like to join him and the hundreds of others who are in our Discord community, well, all the details are in the description. Please like, please subscribe, and as always, stay angry about space.